There are many forces and events that shape and define a nation's collective identity. War is one of the most powerful and mythic ways that individuals and consequently nations define themselves and their sense of purpose. This week's guest has written a book that provides a challenging examination of how war narratives define us and how deeply war is intertwined in what it means to be human. This week on Dialogue, Fighting Identity. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest today is Michael Vallejos. Michael is part of the National Security Assessment Team of the National Security Analysis Department at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. This is his latest book, Fighting Identity, Sacred War and World Change. Michael, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us.
John. I appreciate it.
You know, I've had the advantage of not just reading the book, but also speaking to you and knowing you. And I know that, at least partially, this book represents an increasing sense of urgency that you have in addressing some of the challenges facing the planet.
Yeah, you know, when I started thinking about those things that would lead up to the book, I was really looking at how humanity had transformed in other times. And what is the essence of change in history? And then, you know, reading as I was in late antiquity and the high Middle Ages, which are sort of central periods that kind of help frame what I want to talk about in the book, 9/11 happened. So 9/11 happened, and it was like a thunderclap to me, not as the threat of radical Islam, as so many wish to embrace, but rather a sign that something had happened. Have you ever seen the movie Spartacus? It's a
Yes.
wonderful, somewhat campy movie in which Kirk Douglas, quite to his credit, brought back the great writer, Dalton Trumbo, who had been, you know, exiled totally from Hollywood as a member of the Unfriendly Ten, and had his credit appear and had him return to write the screenplay for Spartacus. At the very beginning in the prologue, the narrator is talking about the world in which Spartacus grew up, which is about 70 BC, and he says that the age of the dictator was at hand, waiting in the shadows for the event to call it forth. And this spoke to me so powerfully, as it has across the years, of how change is apprehended by us, how we see change. We see change when the event comes that basically says it's all over. Everything has been overturned. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, or say the fall of the Bastille in 1789, these were the kinds of great events. But they were not the change. They were the announcement, annunciation of
So that's
the
what
change.
9/11 is to you. It's a symptom of the change. It's not the change itself.
Right, but what was it an announcement of? To most Americans, it was an announcement of, oh, we have a new enemy who is just like the Soviet Union, that we must embrace as the evil other who will help shape our new approach to the world for the next 60 years, as communism did in the Cold War. But in fact, the more I explored what was going on in the world of Islam, the more I began to see that Islam itself, and especially the Islamist variants on Islam, the heresies within Islam, the new interpretations of Islam, were all guideposts to larger changes in humanity. And what I began to see was that in the war, what the United States was doing was responding to Islamist movements and groups by engaging them in a way that would help fulfill exactly what they sought. In other words, the United States became the midwife, the decisive participant who helped to create the narratives of new identity. And suddenly, it became clear to me that this was not simply a a phenomena or activity that could be encompassed by a banner like the global war on terror, but rather that this was in fact an expression of a larger world transformation.
You know, when you talk about these changes being long time in the making, but we only identify them at these eventful moments, as is foretold in the line from Spartacus, I wonder about 9/11 and this momentum. You know, in some cases, people think this was the redefinement of the global paradigm post the Cold War paradigm, this war on terror paradigm. But when I hear you talk about this, maybe it suggests something that is longer term. Perhaps this is something that this was in many ways a correction. And what I mean by that is the Cold War created this almost artificial freeze of history and historical currents because of the standoff between the two superpowers and the nuclear arsenals pointed at each other. Once that was taken away, the genie's out of the bottle, and all of these things that have been percolating up for generations come to the forefront.
I think that speaks rather nicely to what we've been seeing in the world. Let's look at larger rhythms in humanity, especially Western humanity. What we call modernity began in the French Revolution and was focused on the compelling passion of the nation state, in which whole nations were willing to send their young manhood to the battlefield, and these young men would sacrifice in the thousands and even the millions. It was a powerful vision of human meaning. That vision actually began to subside in World War I. And by the end of World War II, a 30 years war, if you will, World War I, World War II, the entirety of European civilization had essentially collapsed. So the entire essence of modernity, which is based on Europe essentially creating a globalized world based, and I must confess this, as we all must, on imperialism and colonialism. That world, which is so powerful in 1914, essentially destroyed itself. And so a European vision of human progress and the human future that everyone understood in 1914 as inevitable was by 1945 deeply corroded and on the verge of collapse. Who rescued that? The U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. and the Soviet Union together in the Cold War preserved a kind of codependent but necessary framework of authority that kept modernity alive. The sad and completely unexpected outcome of the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Soviet Union, meant that the U.S. was the sole nation state in the West charged with maintaining the global world created by Europeans after 1789. And as the global war on terror has shown, we are not capable of doing this. And that is the place that we stand today. In other words, we have taken modernity to its final place, and we can't manage it anymore.
These ways that we associate with group identity, the universal approach, the nation state, the tribal relations. Well, you say in the book that the nation state is the dominant of the three by
in
far.
modernity, yes.
And why is that the case? What is it about that particular form of identity that is so compelling?
Well, the organizing concept of the book is that the essence of meaning, belonging, and togetherness, everything that makes life worth living, is rooted in identity. And identity is all about our own lives connected to others in ways that make our short time here on earth not just meaningful, but worthwhile. And so the essence of religion is really ancestor worship originally, going back to the Pleistocene and before. The origins of our togetherness are in believing that we are part of this great river of people from past into future. Now, clearly in the periods of human development since then, where you saw pastoral and agricultural societies get more complex, you had the emergence of tribes, and then eventually with the Neolithic and the invention of agriculture, far more complex societies. And yet in every case, community was rooted in the togetherness of people and the way in which their own personal identity was connected to the whole. Not just the whole of the tribe now, but the whole of the tribe from past into eternal future. Now, the nation state in many ways represents the most powerful apotheosis of that idea, in which a nation of millions of people who don't know each other personally can feel this incredibly passionate sense of connection to everyone else, and also to what we have been and what we will be. And you see this triumphant in the United States after the American Revolution. You see it triumphant in France, in Germany. This created amazing energy that was sort of stored in these societies. And that energy has, over the last century, been expended. And what you're seeing today is that what modernity created in terms of the religious nationalism of the last 2 centuries has been pretty much expended. The other thing you notice, which is also visible all around us, is that in an effort to create a kind of universal vision, European religious nationalism essentially conquered the world in the 19th century. What they tried to do over time, and very imperfectly, was to create little Western nation states, little eaglets, little clones. And up to a point, up to the 1960s, that seems to have been successful. In other words, in the era of decolonization after World War II, all of these European-created states that had once been colonies, whether it's Nigeria or Kenya, or even the nation states of Latin America, or China that had been brought down and run by the Europeans for almost a century, or the Indian Empire run by the British, all of these places were seen as new Western nation states that didn't last.
Recreating the world in our own image.
Yes, and it lasted in some places like India and China because India and China had a basis for building that kind of identity. But 40 to 50% of humanity is in a different state. Mm-hmm. Their old world was torn down. The nation as an alternative vision presented by the West failed them.
Their chief affiliation or sense of identity doesn't come from the nation state.
No, it doesn't, because, and especially when most of the elites that were anointed by the European colonial powers to take over turned out to be impossibly corrupt and parasitical. So if you look at Nigeria, Nigeria's elite is still connected to the world of Europe, but they have completely abandoned their own people. So if you were to look at the world today, 40 to 50% of humanity has been abandoned. Their old ways of life over the last century and a half have been torn down. And so what you see is the emergence of new visions and new ideas, which really speak to...
By non-state actors.
Yeah, by non-state actors. And some of them are fighting groups, but most of them are movements, communities that are in resistance, and they're looking to find their own fulfillment where the failed ersatz European nation state that succeeded colonialism has given them nothing. And in the process, what that means is that you have a world that looks like a petri dish. In other words, Europe came in, cleared the decks, massive cultural creative destruction, and then eventually springing up were not clones of Western European religious nationalism, but rather strange, syncretistic, mutant things. Mm-hmm. And that's what you have now.
And when you use when you invoke religion and you talk about holy wars or sacred wars, mm-hmm. you're not talking about traditional dogma, you're talking about something that is, here's one of the phrases from the book: war is humanity's dark liturgy.
Right.
And let's focus for a second, almost a lightning round. I'm going to give you these wars in American history. You tell me what the narrative is that you've identified. The Revolutionary War, what was the narrative that defined America? It was the narrative
of origination.
The birth of a nation.
It was not just the birth of a nation, but it was the ratification of God's mission to America.
God's will that America
the city on the hill, that all those who had come here, whether you start with Cotton Mather or others, Catholics and others who were not part of the original Calvinist migration, that they were fulfilling the first step of God's plan for America.
Civil War.
Civil War
What's the narrative?
the Civil War's narrative was self-redemption. The United States had become corrupted. It had failed the charge of God. Slavery, of course, for the South, it was, the failure, an overweening despotic central state, but mostly it was slavery. So the United States redeemed itself in the Civil War and could once again resume the path.
Which leads us to the World War narrative.
Right. And there are two World War narratives. The first was Wilson's. Here we are at the Wilson Center. That failed. Why did it fail? Because the U.S. was not ready. The U.S. was not ready to support Wilson. And what is that narrative? That was a narrative of doing it too early. And it was also a narrative of the U.S. not being up to the task. And so everything that comes after, including the Great Depression and the intervention in World War II, is America coming back, showing itself to be worthy and ready. So that under FDR, the United States fully embraces and redeems humanity, destroys evil in an apocalyptic event.
Then the so-called war on terror becomes saving the world.
Well, the war on terror was an attempt by...
Or saving humanity even, perhaps.
It was an attempt to do that on the cheap, and it was an attempt to do that without really invoking the totality of sacred war.
So sacred war on the side.
Sacred war. Sacred war. See, the essence of it is that sacred war is the passion of the nation. Sacred war is about the sacrifice of the best young men of the nation, almost in a Christ-like fashion, to fulfill and permit the transcendence of realization, whatever that is.
Is there an imbalance now between the United States and its enemies in that the United States doesn't have the buy-in you just described, but our enemies do?
Well, I wouldn't call it an imbalance. I'd call it a compartmentalization. In other words, a segment of the United States, a segment of American society, which I call in the book the Tribal Confederacy of Defense. This nation within a nation of some 30 million people.
And this is the Defense Department, the enlisted men, the military-industrial complex. This is the group?
Yeah, all of them, and their families, which makes it something close to 30 million people. They're the ones who, as Sarah Palin said, are the true Americans. They take up the challenge, they sacrifice. They are enriched and noble. Pardon me?
The rest of us shop.
Yeah, the rest of us were called by George Bush in a number of speeches, shopping America. Go shopping, that's your highest civic virtue. But this creates a civic and religious divide. So the only true Americans are those who sacrifice, and they are enriched by it. The rest of America becomes something less. And that's not good for our country. And it deprives America of the capacity to mobilize its resources to pursue a truly great war, if that's what it wants to do. But it also creates suspicion and us-them within America itself. Mm-hmm. In other words, if Sarah Palin could say, those who are sacrificing and serving are the true Americans, then what's shopping America then? Who are these people? So, in a sense, the body of the book talks about war not only as an instrument of transformation, but also the essential ritual passage that reaffirms, celebrates, recreates, and renews identity. And that's true for all modern societies.
Talk also about the flip side of this. How does our identity and how do our sacred wars define our enemy's sense of identity?
Well, what we do in war is what the enemy does. And what you have in the global war on terror after 9/11 is you have a perfect symmetry between the narrative and the us-them framing of the enemy that is absolutely symmetrical and mirror-like between Americans and Muslims. So Americans look at the enemy as the evil other. So does the enemy, meaning the Muslim Ghazi who are fighting us. And both of them, which is to say both the Tribal Confederacy prosecuting this war and its enemy, which includes Taliban, Al-Qaeda, whole numbers of groups of Islamist Ghazi or holy warriors, They both have narratives that are very similar and that both see sacrifice as essential to transcendence, that both understand that the engagement and the narrative of fighting itself is the path to identity. Now that is a tough issue for Americans. It's there every day. If you were to go on the military channel or the history channel, which many call the Hitler channel for good reason, I mean, you would see these religious narratives played out 24/7.
How would a nation go about defending its interests, defending itself physically from attack, and not fuel this counterproductive narrative?
Well, European nations can do it because they are now so detached from the sacred narrative, because the sacred narrative destroyed them in the 30 Years' War from 1914 to 1945. So they're not buying into that. The only Western society that really buys into that still is the United States.
Can the United States change course? Can the narrative be changed in midstream?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, the problem today, and you see this with our own president and his relations with our military, and you see this in the commentary that surrounds that relationship, is that Americans are afraid of betraying or losing the narrative, and more importantly, they're afraid of being fingered as being against the narrative. And the power of the Republican conservatives is whether or not they are in power, it doesn't matter, because when it comes to our relations with the world and this issue of sacred war, they own the narrative. They appropriated that narrative at the end of the Carter administration. Carter administration was decisive because that's when Democrats lost the narrative. They'd all become managers like Harold Brown. They had no idea what the real sources of power and passion were in war. Reagan did. And he just took it and made it part of the Republican Party, and now the Democrats are afraid constantly that they will be branded as not simply unpatriotic, but as unmanly, as unworthy of being Americans. So that means that this war that began on 9/11 can continue forever.
I feel compelled right now to say something to our viewers, and that is to recommend the book highly, Fighting Identity, not just because we decided Mike was a worthy guest, but because we have barely begun to touch on so much of what is in this book, and we're almost out of time. And it's interesting, it's challenging, and it's a great antidote to the oversimplification that you see on so much cable news and other places. A little plug I did for you, because basically out of the guilt that I know we're not going to do justice to the discussion in the time remaining. But let me ask you this: you do get into some potential solutions to this sort of road to nowhere or a road to catastrophe, and one is it just seems so against the grain of how we operate now. Build non-state relationships and let change happen. I mean, we're the great managers of change. We're the ones who create stability in the world. This just doesn't sound like a natural mission for the United States.
It's not natural. The natural mission is to go and kill Adolf Hitler, as Brad Pitt and his friends do in the latest, fantasy narcissistic epic. The truth of the matter is that our engagement with our enemy helps build their narrative and thus their identity. We are the midwives to the future we do not want. Rather than doing that, and doing that so relentlessly as we're about to do in Yemen now, what we need to do is step back and say, let it happen. We've been preserving the dusky crusts, the brittle shell of Western modernity in the form of the Pharaoh in Egypt, these corrupt, pathetic eunuch princes in Saudi Arabia, on and on and on. We support the past. If we were to simply not be there and let things evolve, you would find a new world, but that new world would evolve. And as we see from the history of Islam, if we want to talk about Islam, that world evolves to become reasonable and civilized. It is not going to stay in the dark realms of the primitive, if in fact it is there now. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the U.S. is perpetuating a world that is drawing us in more and more in ways that will turn us in to the, it's like the dark side of the Force.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the United States, as a national identity, needs to reclaim its original vision of altruism in the world. We're engaging the world totally on a militarized level right now.
Mike, you are very engaged with the defense community and have a history with working with them. You've just recently briefed people from the CIA. What's the reception from the 10% of America who are the real Americans, according to Sarah Palin, that you are briefing on these matters? How do they react to this?
It's a tough sell. I mean, to be honest, the Tribal Confederacy has embraced a vision of forever war, where there's evil out there and we fight it forever. That's what we do. It's a lifestyle exercise. It's a practice. It's like being an ophthalmologist or a urologist. This is what you do. How do we do it better? Ergo, how do we do better counterinsurgency? How do we do what we do better? But the whole point is we do it. And it's not a strategy, it's a lifestyle. And in that context, you have a tribal confederacy that is locked into a vision of war, and an American, shopping America, the 90% of America that is totally disengaged and also afraid because they've never served, they don't feel they can have anything to say. You create a world in America where 90% is civically disengaged and 10% are the real Americans. That's a recipe for the destruction of the American Republic. I don't know if you've ever read Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein, but the premise of that book was, okay, you're engaged in this forever war with an evil alien star cluster, and the only Americans who have the right to vote are those Americans who serve. And by the way, they all go into the forever war. Rest of America, they have rights and all the rest, they just can't vote. What kind of society would that be? A very interesting society, very reminiscent of Sparta. That seems to be the way America is heading right now.
Well, we began with Spartacus, we end with invoking Sparta again.
Yes,
Mike,
indeed.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Good luck with the book. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this discussion, but in addition to wishing Mike good luck with the book, I want to thank you for watching and also for listening, and we appreciate your comments and hope that you will send them to us. And you can do that by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. And we'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, on behalf of the Dialogue production team and all the staff here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.